750 billion euro plan, which is a recovery plan earlier. This helped to get the continent back on its feet after majority of its economies were dealt a crippling blow by the coronavirus pandemic and the lockdowns. However, implementing the plan will not be easy amid disagreements within the 27-member bloc. Italy and Spain, which are the countries worst hit by the pandemic, are slated to be the biggest beneficiaries. Italy would receive up to 81.8 billion euros in direct aid and 90.9 billion euros in loans, while Spain would receive 77.3 billion euros in aid and 63.1 billion euros in credit. However, not many members agree to this plan, especially the Nordic nations. Sweden has already said that it will not support the recovery plan, as it was proposed by France and Germany last week, but has hinted at willingness to discuss a way forward with the bloc's other members. The proposal, which has taken up elements from the Franco-German plan, has stirred up a major debate in Europe. We are now being joined by DW correspondent Stephen Beardsley, live from Berlin, for all updates on this. Stephen, welcome to WION. Now, EU recovery plan is a massive plan, and Spain and Italy are likely to be the major beneficiaries of it. That's what we are hearing. But just how dramatic is this step for a 27-nation bloc?
Well, it's a very dramatic step. Remember, this is a bloc that's always had as a taboo, at least a lot among many of the nations. It's been a taboo that joint debt would be issued. That is, that nations would borrow to basically help other nations. And that's essentially what's being done here. It's not as dramatic as was officially or was originally proposed. That is the Corona bonds, the idea that nations would put their credit ratings together and basically take out debt. Instead, it's the EU itself. And so this gives a lot more institutional power to Brussels. It will be borrowing money on markets against its own budget. And it has a very good credit rating. So countries would only be exposed to the extent that they are contributors to the overall EU budget. And they'll basically be guarantors for these bonds. So the exposure is less. That would seem to appease a lot of the countries. But there are, as you mentioned, those countries who are skeptical. They've always been skeptical of closer fiscal coordination, but a lot of advocates of this plan say, look, if you believe in the single currency, which is elemental to the single market, which is at the heart of the bloc, really what makes it so powerful, such a powerful economic player in the world, then you're going to have to take steps, radical steps, to save this currency. And that's what a lot of people see this as. So we'll see what happens with those skeptical nations in the days and weeks ahead, if they basically come in line, or if they continue to raise protests or even offer alternatives.
Right. So the big question really is, Stephen, at this moment, will this plan work? Is it a sea change? And what does it tell us about cooperation at a time when many nations across the world are pulling apart?
Yeah, it would be a sea change. And it would also be directed at populists. Keep in mind that a lot of these protests that are coming out or that have come out in recent years, they've been against the facelessness of Europe, the facelessness of Brussels, the facelessness of Euro institutions. So they say, hey, we don't really know what this is. This is taking our sovereignty away from us. I think there's a question here of whether this is going to help or hurt in that regard. Now, for populists in Italy, for example, who say, hey, what has the euro ever done for us? Maybe this would actually help if things play out the way Brussels hopes it does, and they can be seen as riding to the rescue. But maybe for populist movements in other states, those so-called frugal states, maybe this angers them a little bit more when they say, hey, we're on the hook here for debt that's really going to other nations who we consider not to be as frugal as we are. We consider them to be not that thrifty. It turns out here that the coronavirus did the most damage to some of the states that tend to have the biggest deficits every year. They tend to have the largest amount of debt. Italy, Spain, also France has a lot of debt. And so it's really in some ways exacerbating that disagreement between both sides. But again, it really is fundamentally going to come down to what's it going to take to save this currency and to save this bloc. And so we'll see whether countries fall in line.
Absolutely. Stephen, you mentioned some traditional European powerhouses like Italy, France, Spain, who are in debt. Now, what does Germany stand? While some bigger European countries are under debt, Germany is the largest European economy, and it too is looking at a 6% decline in GDP this year.
Right. Germany traditionally has been very debt averse, at least when it comes to, well, actually overall it's been debt averse. It has one of the lower debt to GDP ratios in EU countries. It famously tries not to take any deficit spending on in its annual budget. And so it is very debt averse, and it's also been very averse to taking on debt in the name of the EU, and also doing anything that it believes would subsidize or bail out countries that it believes aren't fiscally strong performers, basically those like Italy and Spain. So there will be a lot of criticism about this, also perhaps because the economy is suffering. But at the same time, you have to remember that a cornerstone of the German political belief here, the mainstream German politics, is that Germany will not thrive without a thriving Europe. And I think that's increasingly being recognized. It's recognized on both sides of the aisle, at least among the mainstream parties. And so while a lot of people say it is a reach for what Merkel has done, she came out early with Emmanuel Macron, president of France, and said, we are going to do this. It's also in line with Germany's beliefs that it has to be the linchpin for a successful EU,
right,
because that will make a successful Germany.
Stephen, thank you so much for joining us. We'll keep an eye out on the days and months ahead on how Europe manages to recover from this pandemic and the lockdown.